space. It's been owned by CITGO for decades. It's got changed through many different, before that it was owned by many different people. I first came here around 2016, 2017, when the tanks were still here. So just to kind of lay it out to get your brain, because I like you to have this vision, because as we drive, you will see the difference, okay? We are right here. You came across this bridge. This over here is Pennsauken. Petty's is technically part of Pennsauken. I'm not sure why. This is Camden, New Jersey. Camden has an amazing waterfront right now, okay? And you're gonna see views of it. It's gorgeous. You came across here, we're standing right here. We're gonna drive down this road. As we drive past here, I want you to notice this was the area that CITGO used for storage. And it used to have all these tanks. All of these tanks are gone. The only thing left is the warehouse. You can see the top of it over there. We have a couple stray little buildings here and there. And there's a building right here, which is the CITGO headquarters. It's just offices. But all of this is open. We call these impoundments. These we know probably have some remnants of petrochemicals still. That's where a lot of the remediation is happening. It is not dangerous. We have wildlife here. We have turtles, we have snakes, we have birds of every kind. I see egrets and herons here. We have killdeer nesting here. We have so much activity here, okay? We also, we know there's no frogs, and that's because there might be still some petrochemicals there. But any other species, yeah, they're all there. When we go down further, we're gonna loop around. We're gonna pass that section down there. That was actually subleased to Crowley Marine, and they handled cargo containers. They are the ones who gave this island a reputation as the place with the trucks. Because this didn't make much difference in Camden, but these guys were constantly going on and off the island through the neighborhoods you came through, okay? Cargo containers, the cargo ship would come up, offload the cargo containers, they'd be taken off the island, more would come in, go on and go back down the Atlantic and the Caribbean. So all of that now is gone. That's a meadow. It's a tick haven, but it's a meadow. But we're gonna drive through that and you're gonna see it's very different looking. When we get down here, we're gonna do the full loop of that southern tip. We'll get views of Philly and Camden on both sides. It looks amazing. When we will visit the marine terminal and then we'll walk back up to the cars, okay? Just one other thing so you can orient yourself where you are on the planet. This is the Delaware River. It's in that direction. That is the main channel. Petty, sitting in the Delaware, creates what we call a back channel. And this is a much calmer area. We don't have big ships here. Coming in here is the Cooper River. And we just designated the Cooper River and this back channel as the Cooper River Trail. And what that means is we are getting funding to put access points. We paddle back here all the time on kayaks and canoes. And it's a great place. The only thing you have to be careful of is the tides. If you don't know the tides, you could get in trouble back here. We are going to be near low tide, so you will see the mud flats. So the island is massive. It's 400 acres or so, 500 if you count in the mud flats. We have deer, we have foxes. You won't see foxes. We know there's a coyote running around. We don't see him until at night. We have osprey and eagles. We have all kinds of migratory birds coming through right now. If you're a birder, this is the time to be here. We do have snakes and turtles. You probably won't see much of them. And we do have frogs in our freshwater ponds. I will tell you one thing though, this is a barometer for climate change. We are already seeing our ponds at very low levels, almost dry. This happened last year and we had 3-4 months of drought. So we see it's happening again this year. We desperately need some water. The animals seem fine. They came back when the rains came, but they're going to have to figure out a way to get through the winter again, okay? So I think, Bob, do you have anything to say before we start? Okay, so we're going to go to the cars. I'm going to put this away. Follow me down. We're going to drive very slow. Just keep your eyes open. You never know when you're going to see something.
Well, good morning, everybody. As you heard, my name is Bob Shin. I am a retired utility executive, but now I'm an amateur historian. And I'm also the treasurer of the Camden County Historical Society. So I'm responsible for making sure their money gets invested in the right places. I got involved in Petty's Island starting in 2004 when my dear wife said, we've got to go to a meeting where an oil company wants to give away an island to the state. And we want to be there to support that. And I didn't even know what island she was talking about, but I went to the meeting in Camden, and I knew the director of the Sierra Club personally. He was a friend of mine, and he said, so Bob, if you're going to say anything, make it real quick because we want to get to the vote. I said, why? He said, well, they're going to turn it down. I said, what do you mean they're going to turn it down? He said, well, the fix is in. Every elected official, every mayor, every state assemblyman and senator, the Democratic Party, all are in favor of rejecting this island as a wildlife reserve because they want to develop it into a golf course and a hotel and to, I guess you would call it a gated community for upper income people. And I couldn't believe this was happening. I listened to the arguments. Then the trust, New Jersey Natural Lands Trust was the entity holding this hearing. They voted on whether to accept this proposed gift of the island from the CITGO Petroleum Company. And they voted in favor of it, 5-3. So we're all cheering and everything. And then Michael Catania, who was then the chairman, said, well, before you start cheering, I have to tell you that under the rules and law of our New Jersey Natural Lands Trust, at least one person has to vote in favor of this who is employed by the state of New Jersey. In other words, who has their seat on the Natural Lands Trust by virtue of their office, like they work at the DEP or they work someplace else. And of course, turns out that the governor had instructed all of his representatives to vote against accepting the island. So I think one abstained, but the other 3 voted against, and the 5 public members all voted in favor, and it was declined. That's where my journey into the history of Petty's Island began, because I couldn't believe this happened. So there are many, many stories. Their history is just a lot of good stories, hopefully factual based. And I mean, I could, as you or probably heard, I can just go on and on forever talking about the story. So I'm going to try just to pick a few today to share with you. And if you have any questions when we get to the end, we'll go down some of the other paths. But the main story about this island and why it's so significant is that it started out not quite like this, but in a natural state, only used, and I use that word loosely, by the Native Americans who lived here, who you probably know were the Lenape, Native Americans. And it went through a whole series of uses, culminating in probably the worst use, which as an oil terminal and refinery facility. And now we're going back full circle, so it's returning back to nature and a wildlife reserve, never to have that happen again. So you won't find too many examples of a parcel of land this large, this close to 2 cities that's gone through that experience. I've searched for them, there aren't any. They're going to be nature preserves like this one is. So you are privileged, I am privileged to take you through here. But because of all those changes that took place, I don't have any artifacts to you. I can't walk into Carpenter's Hall and say this is where they met, and, to do Articles of Confederation, or here's Independence Hall, here's where they signed the Declaration. There aren't any artifacts. So you have to use your imagination as we go to different points along, and we try to help you a little about that with some of these wayside exhibits. But the other major story is this is a real estate story, and it's a real estate story of how Europeans came to this world and what their view of property meant and how it worked, and how that worked in conjunction with the views of the Native Americans who lived here, what they thought, and how that evolved, and how uniquely, I like to say, here in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, it was tended to be settled, quote, amicably. There was no wars like there were in New England. I don't know if you know about the Pilgrims. Their descendants fought the Pequots and massacred them up in Connecticut and Rhode Island. In Virginia, they had giant battles between the initial settlers and the Native Americans there. William Penn prided himself, at least, with a peaceful initial encounter, despite the fact that most of the, I guess almost like 90%, I've been told, of the Native Americans who were living here when the Europeans first contacted died because they didn't have immunities from diseases that the Europeans brought with them. So, and that applied to here as well. So you have, this is a story of ownership and use and land use and property in transition. The one artifact that we have at Haverford College, you see reproduced here. This is a deed where 4 representatives of the local Lenape signed an agreement with a young Quaker woman, I think she was about 21 or 22 at the time, to acquire the right of using this island. And what's unique about this document is that it indicates that she understood that she wasn't buying complete control of the island, because the document actually says that the Lenape were reserving the right to continue to hunt and fish here, and they expected to have annual meetings with her or her descendants, where they were going to exchange gifts, in other words, like a continual rental payment, if you will. If you read the fine text, it says the initial payments were to be annually in rum and gunpowder, which wasn't a good combination of things. That later got changed to a garment called a match coat, which is a big cloak that they like to wear, that Europeans would bring. And the Lenape, in exchange, agreed that as long as these transactions continued, that they would respect her use of the land. They would not harm her hogs. That's what it's mentioned right in the text. Nor would they burn her fields. It used to be a way to hunt. You would start a fire and chase the animals and then shoot them as they came out of the fire. And that they would continue, like I said, to hunt and fish and dig up certain roots that they liked. They mentioned some specific ones here. And that this went on for some time. And even when William Penn came, his initial deeds had the same concept in them. But eventually, when William Penn passed away, his sons, who weren't as good to people as he was, decided to clamp down and convert most of these deeds to absolute rights, and Indians couldn't come wander onto people's property anymore. I did a paper with a teacher from a history teacher, or she's retired now, from Lehigh University, who was looking at this deed one day and looking at something called a confirmation deed that Elizabeth Kinsey's husband had to get after William Penn claimed he owned this island, not her. And the Lenape didn't write their names out, they used signs. So you'll see that it's their marks are on here. And when we looked in the Camden County Historical Society Library, where we have a copy of this original, somebody had written the names of the Lenape chiefs who had signed this. They were called sachems. But then they got to the fourth one and they said, Oginaqua, her mark. It was a woman's mark. The first time we realized that this whole transaction involved women. A woman was buying the island. It was witnessed by a very important Quaker woman, and it was signed over by a Lenape woman as one of the 4 co-signers. So that was quite an interesting opening for us to then, in the paper, if you ever want to look at the paper, it's on Stockton University's Sojourn magazine, journal that we wrote the article. And it's all about the role of women in real estate in early years. So I like to start off the day with the greeting that you would have gotten had you shown up here 400 years ago. By the way, did anyone know who were the first Europeans to even establish a settlement here in the Delaware River?
The Dutch.
The Dutch is correct answer. And who were the second Europeans to come?
The Swedish.
The Swedes, correct. New Sweden is mentioned the lower Delaware. So the English they were the third. and they came after the English Civil War and the Cromwell Protectorate, and they finally got their act together. Charles II sent his armies over to capture New York, which was New Amsterdam, and then take over the South River as well, which was the Dutch taking over, and the Swedes after that. So if you would just raise your right hand and repeat after me. Hey, Nule Linkum, Alipak, Akinakaskaka. Now you just learned the first name of the island, Kinakasaka. For the life of me, I didn't know what it meant, and I used the English interpretation. This is on a map that a Swedish engineer did, and that interpretation was it meant the place where the panther ran. I mean, how could that be? And then I read actually there were panthers running around. Some indentured servant made the hike from Burlington down to Philadelphia and encountered a panther one day, so they were here. But I didn't feel comfortable with that idea, so I called the Lenape descendant tribe that's in Oklahoma now. We chased them out west and up north, and I said I'd like to talk to the language expert. I said, "Is that really what it is?" He said, "Give me a couple weeks to research it with my people." And he came back and he said, "We think that it's more likely to mean the place under the reeds, which would be consistent with what this place was like before the topography changed. It was very low, low tide, there'd be lots of reeds. When the first Dutch settlers came here, they bypassed Petty's Island and went up to Burlington Island to set up their trading post because it was too hard to get access to the hard land here because of all the reeds that were around. So now you know the first name of the 5 names of what became Petty's Island as we make our tour. In addition, you're going to learn about the Cooper family. You know, a lot of things in Camden named after Cooper. At one time, Joseph Cooper pretty much owned most of this island. We'll talk about that. You're going to learn about the role of enslaved and indentured servants on this island. You're going to learn about the evolution of uses here, ranging from early agriculture to shipbuilding and culminating with the oil tanks and refineries. And then you'll learn about the history of how this island was saved, which we'll do when we get to the terminal. We forgot. We have some special guests on this tour today. Will the Petty family raise their hand?
The Petty family.
Okay.
Their last name is Petty.
I misspoke when I said we had no artifacts. You can see there's 4 or 5 here. Can any of you figure out what these are if you look at the topography here and here? The draining something? Yep, what?
Water.
Yes.
Water from?
Rain.
Flooding.
On the other side of there?
The river.
The river? No.
That's close.
You're going to hear, one of the stories of the island is it's almost been geoformed. I don't know if that's the right word, changed over time, primarily due to dredging. And the fact that in colonial times, the back, as Linda said, it's called the back channel over here, was considered the main passageway for sailboats and rowboats going from Burlington to Philadelphia. They would come up this back channel. And years later, we decided as a society that we wanted to deepen the main channel on the Pennsylvania side, and it had to be dredged. So it's the sandbars and stuff. And the dredging process that they used was called hydraulic dredging, which you can still see if you go to the park right under the Tacony-Palmyra Bridge there. It's a pipe that goes down in the bottom of the river, and it's like a vacuum cleaner. It sucks up about 90% water, 10% gravel, sand, etc., and pumps it. And you have to put it in a confined dredge spoil containment area. That's what this is. This is like a big swimming pool for wet dredge spoil that gets pumped into the pool and settles. And to help the water drain out, I've climbed up there and looked, there's actually like a drain in the middle there. It comes out and goes out through these pipes. That's why there's a gigantic mud flat here, mud, because that got washed out along with some of the water when this drained out. So there are a couple artifacts around this. That's another one. It's sort of symbolic of all the dredging that took place here. It was so significant, and I'll try to show you where on the other side of the island. They dredged away almost a third of the island's acreage on the Pennsylvania side, but they added to it on this side. So if you look at the shape of the island over time, different charts and maps, you can see how it got narrower, wider there, and narrower here. The waterway got narrower here because, especially at low tide, you'll see these gigantic, like we can see it's where the spatter dot goes. Eventually that'll all be drained out, and the so-called channel will be just a little, almost like a little stream of over here on the back channel from where the Cooper River joins. We'll see it further up.
If you actually look out there now, you'll see a line of birds. They are at the edge of the mud flat where the water is. So that's where the tide is at this moment, and they're walking on the mud flat and getting food that's being exposed. We have the tide coming in, but they'll follow that line, and you'll see where it is.
There used to be a Lightship anchored off of the inlet there at Barnegat, and that's it right over there. You can see that red vehicle, that red ship. That was the Lightship. They got replaced by a buoy, as did the lighthouse.
And I'll tell you just a little bit how that ship got there. That's on a property of a guy named Rod Sadler. He was an amazing Camden resident. He was like the harbor master at Wiggins Marina for a while. He had his own marina here. But he also was that guy, and you know that guy. He's like, oh, your boat doesn't work? I'll take it. I'll fix it someday. And so he wouldn't let anybody throw boats away. So he started collecting boats on that property till it got to be about 200 boats. And then he did what everyone eventually does. He died. So his family decided they wanted to move away, and that is a prime piece of real estate. But it was full of boats. And with the help of many, many organizations in Camden and in Camden County, the county bought that property. So it is now part of the county. New Jersey Conservation Foundation has removed a significant number of the boats, and they're still working on it. New Jersey DEP is working on the permitting to get it cleaned up, and it will then be part of this park. That's North Camden with Pine Point Park right there.
To make you aware, we're now on the top of one of the edges of one of those dredge spoil disposal facility walls.
Yeah,
so
we just walked. Look how far down
this is all built up to contain, and they used to dump the watery sludge here, and it would drain out. You see, it's settled down, and we're walking on the top of the wall now. This was not part of the island's original topography. If you look carefully along the bottom edge where the water comes up, you might see some stones further up. That marks the perimeter of the original island. I had old maps that show that when this was heavily organized for agriculture, they would have ditches and walls to drain the water and capture the water and make sure the fields would get irrigated and the water released when there was too much water. So it was quite an intensive labor operation to maintain the island in agriculture, given it was so low and subject to flooding all the time. But by flooding, you also got enriched soil coming back, kind of like in Egypt every year. They go through a flood cycle. The land would become very productive. Just to get your orientation, the mouth of the Cooper River is right there to the left of the Barnegat Lightship. And the built-up area here is that new park they built in North Camden. It used to be a trash dump, and before that it used to be the airport.
Oh, wow.
Okay. And for those of you around here, you know that the old milk bottle shaped building, that's Camden City Hall. And the park area that you see under the radio tower there is the park is where William Cooper built his first plantation house. He originally came to Burlington, but decided he didn't have enough land there, and he would go to Quaker meetings with Elizabeth and Thomas Fairman, Elizabeth who owned Petty's Island, and they said, well, why don't you consider taking your proprietary rights and convert it to acreage down near where we live? And he did. And so he started this plantation, then he bought certain ferry rights, and before it was Camden, it was called Cooper's Ferry. If you look on all the old maps, there were only 3 or 4 buildings owned by the Cooper family to operate their ferries and act as a tavern and an inn for people to stay waiting to take the ferry over to Philadelphia from Cooper's Ferry, which then became Camden around 1825.
What does Camden mean?
Well, Camden is named after a British lord, Camden. I know this because at the Historical Society, we got a gift to recondition the big portrait we have of him. It's now in the Camden City Hall. They wanted it back after we got it restored. And he was noteworthy because he was sympathetic to the Americans prior to the American Revolution, that they were getting a raw deal from Parliament with, taxation without representation. That's, they named it after him. In part as a real estate deal. I thought it sounded better to sell real estate than Cooper's Ferry. They'd sell it buy a lot in the city of Camden. The Pine Point Park, Pine Point as it's called, that's also the park's name. There's also a school there that used to be, I think it's a charter school now. It used to be, if you go look at it, it says Pine Point. And it's spelled Pynepoynt. And I thought, they don't know how to spell it, but that's the Old English for Pine Point. And that's, if you look at the deeds that William Cooper had, that's what it said. This exhibit shows you the kind of early ferry vehicle they call. This is called a wherry, W-H-E-R-R-Y, and you can see it had some big sweeping oars, a big steer. This one was capable of carrying a couple of horses and a carriage as well. How the ferry got started was in the early days before Philadelphia was founded, when the Fairmans lived, and we'll see their location across the river here at Penn Treaty Park. That's where they had their house. And William Cooper's house is over here. Those are the 2 biggest houses in the area. They decided to have, instead of going up to Burlington every Sunday, they would still go for monthly meetings, but for weekly they would alternate houses. All the Quakers that lived in this area on the Pennsylvania side and the Cooper's Ferry side, 1 week would all meet in William Cooper's house, and the next week they would all go over to the Fairman's house. And so that was the first, wasn't every day, but it was kind of ferry system to take people back and forth. And then when Penn came and they opened the first meeting house in Philadelphia, there was no need for them to meet in houses anymore, so that ended. But this shows you what the shoreline looked like, and what, I believe this is Samuel Cooper's house. We are at the historic site. We're now in the process of restoring what's called the Benjamin Cooper house, and we're going to make it into, our use is going to be, it's going to be a mini version of the American Revolution Museum that you see in Philadelphia. Ours is going to be dedicated to what happened during the Revolution in southern New Jersey, which is a story that's had not been told. But it's the oldest extant building in Camden now, and it overlooks, you can't see it here, it's up a little bit further, but you could look up and down the river from that location, and that was where they operated the first ferry over to Shakamakson. Interesting story about Benjamin Franklin. You all know that he started out in Boston, where he was apprenticed to his brother. They didn't get along very well, and Ben decided to run away. And he hid away on his ship to New York, visited the printer there that might take him on, because that's what his brother did. And he said, no, I don't have any jobs, but if you get out of Philadelphia, you might be able to get a job. So Ben literally walked across New Jersey to Burlington and just missed the last ferry. So he hung out in Burlington for a while, and there's a story about women feeding him gingerbread there. And then suddenly he heard there was a ferry coming, and so he got on, and it was starting to get dark, so they said, well, you'll have to help row because there's no wind. So he helped row. And they rowed down, again, on the back channel side, and it got dark, and they couldn't see the lights of the city of Philadelphia. And so they were worried maybe they had rowed too far. They didn't want to keep going and wind up, in the ocean, so they decided, well, let's put in for the night, see what the morning brings. So they pulled into the Cooper River, beached their craft, and it was a cold October day, so they took fence rails down. I think it was Joseph Cooper's fence rails, and set a fire to keep themselves warm. And the next morning they woke up and realized they were in the mouth of the Cooper River, and Philadelphia. They couldn't see Philadelphia because the island had blocked their view of the lights in the city. So we know this is true because it was in Ben Franklin's autobiography, and that's the greatest work of fiction in American literature. It's a lot of it's true. That is a funny and unique story. I can't leave this spot without talking about the role of enslaved persons in this area. When I grew up, I always thought slavery was limited to Mississippi and Georgia and places where they had big cotton plantations. And the more I learned about the history here, I came to learn that up until the American Revolution, even the Quakers, who were pacifists, most of them had one or two enslaved persons working in their household. Philadelphia was built in part using enslaved persons' labor. And if it wasn't an enslaved person, it was the next step down, an indentured servant who was in effect a slave, but for a limited period of time, usually 5 to 7 years. Now, we don't have good primary source material in this, but there is evidence that this island might have been used. Remember I told you how Elizabeth Kinsey put her hogs and cattle here? That this might have been used as a depot for the slave trade, since it wasn't easy to escape unless you knew how to swim. And but we do know for sure that Joseph Cooper, who was a descendant of William, he eventually acquired most of this island, most from John Petty's remaining pieces of land he had, and that he had to maintain the dikes and the channels and the sluices on this island. Hard work. And we know he had at least one slave when he died. So our theory is, if he didn't own them outright, he rented them and used them for this hard labor. So,
the Lenape had slaves because a number of indigenous tribes did own slaves.
Yes, that's true. Most of the slaves that enslaved persons that came here originated in the Caribbean. Maybe one or two, I think one of the initial ships might have come from Gambia to Philadelphia, the first ship, but most was a shorter shipment point. And eventually Congress forbade the importation of slaves, even though it didn't outlaw slavery. And then eventually, it's interesting to study the history of New Jersey, and New Jersey was like the last northern state to actually pass emancipation, and they played all these games where they basically changed the status of an enslaved person to an indentured servant, with all the same, just to call them different things, that they were still basically servants of these people. And it wasn't until after the 14th Amendment was adopted that they finally passed and abolished slavery in New Jersey. One of the last states. Most of the enslaved persons in New Jersey were concentrated in the north, in the Bergen County area, where they had a longer tradition. By the time of the American Revolution, the Quakers, in the form of their Philadelphia yearly meeting, which is kind of like the final authority on matters of faith, they had made a determination that owning slaves was inconsistent with their peace testimony, that is, their pacifism, because you can't maintain someone in bondage unless you're prepared to use violence to retain them. So they made it a disownable offense to continue owning slaves, which meant if you refused to follow the teaching and release your slave, just to release them, you have to provide for them, make sure they have, skill or food, whatever, especially if they're older. Then they read you out of the meeting. That meant you could still come to the meeting, and they didn't shun you like Amish would shun people who were, but they wanted the rest of the world to know that this particular individual, who was formerly a member of our faith, is no longer practicing the Quaker faith. So they read them out of the meeting, but they still talked to them. It wasn't like, the only real sanction they had was they wouldn't let someone who'd been read out of me be buried in an Orthodox Quaker cemetery. That was it. And I've done a lot of research on the first cemetery in Camden County, which is very interesting. It's over in in Collingswood, because you have the original Orthodox cemetery where there were hardly any headstones, and right next to it you have the people who fought in the American Revolution, who were former Quakers. They made their own graveyard because they weren't allowed to be buried next to it, and they have lots of monuments that were allowed. So it's an interesting physical manifestation of that division that took place. You see the old Philadelphia Electric power plant on the right, which has now been converted into nice condominiums. And the green area towards the city from it is where Elizabeth Kinsey and her father first landed when they came. I don't think I told you before, but the reason why she came with him is that he was one of William Penn's land commissioners, along with 3 others that were sent over, not for Pennsylvania's purposes. Penn had not yet been granted Pennsylvania yet, but he was a trustee for another Quaker who owned West Jersey, half of New Jersey called West Jersey. And her father, Kinsey, was one of the commissioners. He came over a little bit early to meet the other ones. He got very sick on the voyage, and before he died, he purchased 300 acres surrounding that location, which we now call Penn Treaty Park. It's called the Shakamakson Plantation. And she bought it from some Swedish settlers who became her good friends. When her father died, before he died, they purchased those 300 acres. They took him up. He was the first Englishman, first Quaker to be buried in Burlington, her father. And then she came back here, and like I say, 2 years later, she married Thomas Fairman, who was one of the witnesses on the Indian deed for this island. And so you can see it was a short commute from there to here. It was even shorter then, because if you can imagine the width of the river here being half as wide as it is now, because, like I say, about 150 acres were dredged away right here, and it used to extend almost all the way to the Pennsylvania side. So she didn't have to go too far to get to the island. And that's where she kept her hogs and her livestock. When she died, the island passed to her son, and then her son sold it to John Petty, a Philadelphia merchant. We don't know that great deal about him, except I've located other properties that he owned in and around Philadelphia. And he was the first one really to develop agriculture in a significant way, other than just for cattle. He had an orchard, he built a house, he grew tobacco here. Petty's Island tobacco was considered really good stuff. And because of its proximity to Philadelphia, it was also an ideal place for dairy products. You could milk the cow, make the butter, take it across the river. You're in your biggest market nearby. And we know all this because when he advertised it for sale, he described what was for sale, how many acres of orchard, etc. there are. Then the island got sort of passed down, parceled out. I think the first exhibit here talks about shipbuilding.
Yeah. Trade route.
Yeah.
That's
Well, first, the earliest famous ships that were related to here. Does anybody know where the first steamboat was invented and operated in North America? You think Robert Fulton in New York, right? No. It was here in Philadelphia. And you can see here, come a little bit closer because there's a small rendering. John Fitch adapted a steam engine to what looks like a robot canoe, where you've got 8 paddles on either side of this large vessel being driven by a steam engine, paddling like they were men in a canoe. That was the first steamboat. And later on he developed, it's not on here, another model that had like duck feet. So they had these, like, it wasn't a paddle wheel, but they had these 2 duck feet going like paddling on. And he actually took delegates to the Constitutional Convention on rides around Petty's Island when they were here in Philadelphia negotiating the Constitution, and even ran a ferry service between Philadelphia and Burlington. But the guy had lots of bad luck. He couldn't get Ben Franklin to endorse his invention. His last gasp attempt to get financing was to take the duck foot type vessel down to Virginia, where if he could prove it worked down there, they would give him a monopoly on steamboat travel in Virginia. But a week or 2 before he was supposed to take it down, there was a big storm over here. The ship broke its mooring in a storm and got washed over here up onto the mud flats of Petty's Island. Fitch was terrified. He came over, they couldn't remove it. They had to take the steam boil off. He never got it down to Virginia in time. Long story short, he went bankrupt, went to Kentucky to claim some land, and I think the suggestion is he committed suicide. But he was, in fact, the first operator and inventor of a steam, and there's a museum for him up in one of the suburbs of North Philadelphia if you ever get a chance to visit. Just Google Fitch Museum and you can go see actual scale models of these things. The other famous vessel that died here on Petty's Island was called the Alliance. This was a frigate that was built, one of 13 during the American Revolution. It was built up in Massachusetts. I think it was originally called the Essex. But remember the French, after we won the Battle of Saratoga in New York, decided, okay, they were going to enter a military alliance with the United States and help us fight the British, so to get revenge for their loss in the 7 Years' War. And so they renamed the Essex the Alliance. And what's noteworthy about it is that it took Lafayette on at least 2 voyages back and forth to France during the American Revolution, trying to get more money, more assistance from King Louis XVI. Anyway, after the war, this was the last remaining frigate. All the others were sunk or burned or destroyed during the war. The United States Navy didn't have a lot of success except for John Paul Jones over around England here. But this survived. So the Congress didn't want to have a Navy anymore, and so they sold this in surplus. Robert Morris, who was known as the financier of the American Revolution, he bought it, outfitted it for a merchant ship, and sent it to China for the first time. A Philadelphia ship went to China to trade for tea and China ware and things like that. Made several voyages like that, and finally it was so bad condition that Kensington, they took it to the boatyard here in Kensington, took off all the good stuff, and then floated it over here on the mud flats to die on the shores of Petty's Island. If you look at some of the early maps, this entire island is ringed with these wrecks of ships that got sunk in the mud and just died a death here. So I was on a quest to find out if this still like the hull, still existed anywhere on the island. I got really excited when I was reading some diaries, especially Nichols' diaries, where he suggested that the remains were right off this point here in the mud. And the more I read about it, though, I realized there's another story that showed the Alliance being beached about where the oil tanks used to be, and that area had gotten dredged away when they did all this stuff. And there were reports that people got pieces of the Alliance and made desks out of it and lamps and things to give away. And so, in fact, I saw a piece of it in the museum next to Independence Hall years ago. So I'm not sure which is true, but one of my fellow board members is the president of the Maritime Museum over here in Philadelphia, and we're trying to scheme to get some, underwater topography scanning here, because if you can find a pattern of iron nails and bolts that look like they're a hull, you can have grounds to excavate it. But we just haven't got around to doing it yet. So that's on my agenda. And of course, the Natural Lands Trust wants me to tell the pirate story, right?
Yes.
Blackbeard's treasure here. Did you hand out the shovels? No? There isn't an island in the Delaware where he didn't bury his treasure, but this is... he did come up, I think, certainly as far as Newcastle. I know they have reports that he was in Newcastle, but they had people come out here digging for treasure years ago. It's part of the lure, so we keep it on this exhibit here. And then, of course, the largest shipbuilding company in the world, I guess in the United States, was called William Cramp Shipyard. It was right across the river here. And he started out making his family started making wooden ships for fishing. And what's the name of the fish that every year migrates up and they catch them up in New Hill? Shad. You could walk across the Delaware with the shad from running. It's so thick. But he got to start building shad fishing boats. But his company made the transition from wood to iron and iron to steel, one of the few that did. And up until World War I, he was the largest. And he built, among other things, I don't think we have it here, he built a dredge, of all things, that was sent down to help dig the Panama Canal. So, he also built in the 1850 one of the clipper ships. You've probably heard these are these very fast way to get to the gold fields. He wanted to go from the East Coast to Sacramento to mine gold in 1840, 50 or whatever, 49 years. You could either hike across the country, take forever, or you get on a clipper ship and sail down around South America up. And he built one of these clippers called the Manatee, which is a Lenape word for great spirit. And I think it sunk on its second voyage, so it didn't have good luck. But, it was manufactured here. And what happened was Cramp ran out of space over in Philadelphia, so that's why he built an auxiliary shipyard here. We'll see some artifacts of inlets where he would bring vessels. And another family called the Mandersons owned a big lumber yard over here. They had ran out of space, so they practically bought most of this island and put their lumber stuff here. You can see over here there were streets and avenues and warehouses all around here. There's docking here. It's very interesting to see the old maps before they dredged this all away. And the Mandersons changed the name of the island to Treaty Island in honor of William Penn's treaty over here. But the United States, I guess that's the Oceanographic Office, which is the final authority on the naming of islands, wouldn't change the name. But you'll see many maps after the Mandersons acquired the property that says labeled as Treaty Island. So you've got the place under the reeds at Kina-Kasara. You have the great island lying before Shakamaxon, which was on the deed to describe this place on Elizabeth Kinsey's deed. You have it becoming, I guess, Elizabeth's Island, so she married Thomas Fairman. It was called Fairman's Island. And when John Petty bought it, it was called Petty Island. Not Petty's, Petty Island. And then it was Treaty Island. and then it went back to Petty Island again. So that's what we call it today. Although most people call it Petty's with an apostrophe. If you look at the old prospects of Philadelphia from the New Jersey side, you'll see an island in the Delaware called Windmill Island. It was traditionally considered New Jersey's island because at low tide you could take your cart full of corn or wheat and your horse and go along this gravel pathway out to the windmill, have your stuff ground, and then if the tide went out again, you could bring it back. And so that was traditionally considered New Jersey's jurisdiction. Petty Island was always considered part of Pennsylvania's jurisdiction because it was closer to, I remember before the dredging, to Pennsylvania. And, there was no place to register it in Camden when Thomas Herman wanted to confirm his title. So, where I told you Joseph Cooper bought most of the island, well, Joseph got elected to the Assembly after the Revolution. He owns most of the island. It's in Pennsylvania's jurisdiction. Who owned the islands in the Delaware was a big uncertainty. Which state had of the new states had jurisdiction, because in the original charters that King Charles gave to the owners of New Jersey and to William Penn, defined their borders as the Delaware River. In the case of New Jersey, on the eastern edge, the mean low water of New Jersey. And the same on Pennsylvania. So it left out the islands, and a commission that King charged did the research, and they said, all these islands belong to the king. Well, after the Revolution, it doesn't belong to the king anymore. So the two states of New Jersey and Pennsylvania decide to form a commission, appoint 3 members each of their respective assemblies to work out who's going to have jurisdiction over which island. Joseph Cooper gets himself appointed to this commission. And lo and behold, most of the traditional ownerships were sustained the way they sort of had been up to that point, except here. Windmill Island got given to Pennsylvania, and Petty Island was assigned to New Jersey. And of course, Joseph owned Petty Island. So it's a little self-interest deal that worked out fine for him. If you haven't been to Treaty Island, I recommend you go visit it. Take a pair of binoculars with you and stand at a point where you can look up and see William Penn's statue on top of Independence Hall. And you'll be amazed because you'll see him looking directly at you. Not down the river, not out, straight out. Because Calder, who did the sculptor, did the original design, had read that Penn's most proud accomplishment was his treaty with the Indians and his goodwill. And so he's looking at the place where he did that, and you can see it by looking back at it. I don't think there's anything blocking the way now.
You're talking about on City Hall.
The City Hall one.
Yeah,
From Penn Treaty Park over here. We're only stopping here just so you can see the views of what the tanks looked like before they were removed, and a sample of the wildlife. When you go on the New Jersey Natural Lands Trust website, there's actually a report on all of the creatures they found on this island, all the birds, all the amphibians. It's just an amazingly long list. Yeah. And it's on the flyway of the East Coast, so migratory birds would come from Canada down there's like a refueling stop on the way, kind of like Cape May to the Red Knot going back.
Good. I'm going to show you my favorite place on the island. I like to take people there all the time. It's right down this path. We're going to get a view of Philly. We sort of looked at it through the trees, but you're going to get a good view. I call it the beach, and you'll see why.
I just wanted you all to know this was to me, a sacred site when we first started the battle to try to save the island, because this entire grove of trees here in this usually a wetland, was inhabited by a black-crowned night heron population. They had all their nests in the trees, and it's quite a sight to see. The problem is that, I guess 2 years into the campaign, they just up and left. And I said, what happened? And I started talking to some of the ornithologists, and they said, well, it's their habit. They stay in an area for a while, and you see all this white stuff on the tree, that's their guano, their poo, and they poo the place up, and when it gets intolerable, they move on to another place, wait for the rain to clear it out, and maybe come back someday. So I'm like the return of the swallows. I'm hoping to see someday the return of the black-crowned night heron. Because I don't see the white stuff anymore.
No, but as Bob pointed out, there's usually water here.
Yeah.
This is extremely dry. And last year I saw at this level, like in October. We've already been seeing it in September. So we never got enough rain to overcome the last drought we had. So we're going into another season that will be very dry. So it's a good barometer for that. This is the meadow.
You can imagine, though, what it looked like before the meadow came back. It was entirely covered with the asphalt you see here. And literally hundreds of trailers full of goods for shipment on a barge. And you had all these little trucks that would come and pick up a trailer, haul it over to that terminal you see where we're going to go. And there were 3 different levels, and they would drag the trailer up and park it into the giant barge and come back and get another trailer and take it. And meanwhile, they have trucks coming and going, taking the empties and the full ones to the destination. But it's hard to compare the two, because you just look out here, all you see was trucks and macadam and activity and diesel fumes. Now, my son and I happened to be kayaking on the Delaware. One day a barge was here, and it was huge. It was like 3 stories high. It reminded me like almost a half of an aircraft carrier. It was so high in the water. It had 3 different levels that they would load. And the main route that the Crowley Marine Terminal operated was between here and Puerto Rico, back and forth. And when they had the hurricane, CITGO and the state agreed to give them an extension of their lease here so they could serve emergency recovery supplies down. So how we're going to get there is we're going to walk down this way and try to stick on the macadam that's left. And we're going to go up and go around. You'll see like an artificial inlet that was one time used by Cramps when they had the shipyard, also by the Philadelphia Electric Company, because they used this end of the island as a giant coal storage facility back when the power plants you saw on the river burned coal, and they didn't have enough room to store it over there. So they store the bridge we crossed. You came over to the island. That used to be just a railroad bridge. They'd bring the coal over here, unload it, then they would put it on a barge here and take it over to the power plant that's now the condos. We're next to Penn Treaty Park. Or upriver, there's another power plant that was right next to the Tacony-Palmyra Bridge. Okay, so we'll tell the story of how the island got saved when we get on the site of the future visitor center. Area directly across here used to be the largest anthracite coal export terminal in the United States. They bring anthracite coal from up near Scranton and the Northeast by rail, and there must have been 22 different piers here loading special ships designed to transport anthracite coal. They were called colliers, up and down the East Coast. So it would heat buildings in New York, Washington, D.C., Baltimore, to clean burning coal. You can see if there is such a thing. When I was a little boy, my house was heated with anthracite coal. So now, only a few piers left. One right there. It's called Graffiti Park. A lot of works of art over there. We think it's technically closed to the public, but if you get a chance, I'm told it's well worth walking around and seeing the variety of graffiti that's painted on these old coal loading dock piers. And it's because of this facility that they really had to dredge away a third of Petty's Island over here to make the channel deeper and wider and to be able to turn the vessels here. Well, this is a huge operation, very busy, kind of like the port of Long Beach. If you ever got to California, you'd see what it looks like, a crowded port. And further upriver, you can see a liquefied natural gas terminal. That's that building with the round top and the wake top. Because there's not enough capacity in the pipelines that run from the Gulf here during summer, gas utilities pipe gas, you don't need it for heating, to facilities like that. They liquefy it, they cool it down to make it 1/600th of its volume liquid. And then winter comes, and they're operating at full capacity. Everybody heating their house, those are still heating their house with gas or burns. They then gasify, heat up the liquid, and that way they balance supply and demand. You couldn't do it just from a pipeline. So this is the first tier of loading dock. Like I said, if you can imagine the barge that's tied up here was as taller than the highest point on here where they would load. And to me, I was on an aircraft carrier when I was a Navy, but that would sort of remind me of it. Like several stories tall out of the water. And they could just continually load, and they could come up here and up the ramp, up, like I said, the second part. And it took them a couple of days really to load up the barge. Okay, we're going to get back down here out of the wind, and I'll tell you the story of how the island was saved, and then we'll head back to the furnace.
Okay.
But I'm wearing this shirt not because I expect the Eagles to win the World Championship again this year, but because the Eagles played an important role in the saving of Petty's Island. You heard earlier on the trip, I told you how I got first involved going to the Natural Lands Trust meeting and then turned down CITGO's offer. In the intervening years, starting in 2004, if you can believe it, when they turned it down, an unlikely coalition sprung up. First, on the pro-development side, you had every labor union, every elected official, every politician, from the governor on down, the state senators, all were in favor of developing the island, not preserving it. It's all jobs, economic development, and Pennsauken, understandably, was about to lose their largest rateable when CITGO decided it was no longer going to operate a marine terminal here. That's a separate long story, but I'll make that long story short. They found it was cheaper for them to use an oil terminal about a mile further upriver here, had deeper water, they could bring in deeper drafts, so they could rent the space there and unload their oil cheaper than they could at their own dock, because they had shallower water and smaller ships. So CITGO decided we want to abandon uses here. What's going to be the future use of the island? They entered an agreement with a company called Jerrye, which was known as a brownfield redeveloper. They polluted land, clean it up, build houses, retail, etc. And as they were in the process of doing their due diligence on this transaction, CITGO discovered an eagle's nest here on the island, not too far from where we're parked. Try to point out the approximate location with the leaves. And they looked up the rules and regulations governing development at or near an eagle's nest and found that it's pretty restrictive. Like for the entire breeding season, you can't do anything near, and even in the future, you got to be very careful. So they decided, in consultation with their lawyers, that maybe a better path for them, instead of entering into this agreement to sell or do a joint venture with the Cherokee company, that they would gift the island to the state of New Jersey and thereby control their own rate and pace at cleaning up the island. They knew they were going to have to clean it up one way or another and not be forced to do something quickly and expensively by a developer they were going to partner with. And so they made the approach to the state of New Jersey and said, we'd like to give you this 400-acre island, which, nobody ever offered that much that I can remember before. And the state was spending millions of dollars buying open space, and here they're offering to give it. But then you ran into the political forces that wanted to have it island. So what happened was they discovered this eagle's nest that one day, and from 1994, we formed a group called the Save Petty's Island Coalition, which is the most unlikely coalition of, if you'd ever in the town, you'd have an oil company, CITGO, sort of like beachhead of all things. Then we had our own local groups here called like Cooper Watersheds. And then we had every major environmental group in the state, from the Audubon Society, the Sierra Club, Jersey Conservation Foundation, you name it, they were members of this coalition. And of course, we'd always get together, we'd have to work out our differences, etc. And we started a political campaign trying to say that, trying to get the state to reverse this decision. And I have to tell you, for the first 2 years, we were losing this battle. Looked like it was going to go ahead. But Pennsauken was trying to get, they're not only Penny's Island, but their entire waterfront become as part of this $1 billion project. And when CITGO told Cherokee said, wait a minute, this is very important, because we're not only going to develop Pennsauken, we're going to develop Camden too. That whole area, Saltburn Park, is that. And so there was this giant project, $2 billion project, to completely redevelop 2 zip codes in Camden, lie the people out, using the power of eminent domain. You don't know what that is? That's when the government has the right to seize your property for something. It used to be you could only do it for railroad right-of-ways or hospital or something, but the Supreme Court had made some decision up in Connecticut that said, well, no, if you can increase the tax revenue for a property, that's reasonable grounds for a municipality to seize your private property. Well, CITGO was having none of that. They were opposing it in court. And so Pennsauken then was induced by Cherokee to use their power of eminent domain. They were threatening to seize this island and throw CITGO out at redevelopment with Cherokee. They had a long agreement with Cherokee. And CITGO's strategy was given to an entity that was a higher level of government than the township of Pennsauken. So the theory was, if you could get the state lands trust to accept it, then Pennsauken couldn't use their power of eminent domain because they're lower than the state. And when we ran into problems where the state still refused to accept it, we even tried to get the Department of Interior, to accept it. Ran into all the politics of that.
I actually ran into somebody at a conference in Philly, and he came up from U.S. Fish and Wildlife and started to tell me part of that story.
And for some reason, the office of Massachusetts that had to deal with it. It's a mess. In any event, we were losing the battle. Then one day, a truck driver from this Crowley Marine Terminal was driving down the road, not too far from where we're parked, and he saw this baby eagle just limping across the road. But he called up the CITGO people, they called up the wildlife people, they took it down to University of Pennsylvania has vet center, so exactly where it is, but the eaglet perished. And they were trying to figure out, why did this happen? Usually, if an eagle fledges prematurely and is injured, a parent will take turns on the ground protecting it. The eagles wouldn't have any of it. Then they found this tent, kind of like a camouflage tent they call a bird blind, that was real close to the tree and against the wall. And then they discovered that 2 guys had been trespassing onto the island under contract with Cherokee. And the contract said their job was to observe eagles' sensitivity to disturbance and to see how close you could get to them before they would fly away, so they could show that they could tolerate the construction activity that they were planning to do. And so the theory is that because the Eagle saw that line and saw people down there all the time, they were reluctant to go down to rescue this Eagle. So after a whole summer investigation, the state finally indicted the company that Jerrye had hired to do this observations to test the limits of the Eagle's endurance for disturbance. And then they indicted the company, Jerrye, which always had this reputation of being good green company, good for the environment. You know. And that's when the tide started to turn, started to get public opinion on our side. But it really wasn't until 2007 when, on projects they were doing in North Jersey, this company basically bankrolled the Democratic Party in New Jersey for 3 years. And they had 3 sole source contracts to do billion-dollar projects. 2 here in Camden and Pennsauken, 1 up in the Meadows. That was a little further advanced than these. And they finally dug in to find out how they were doing the financing. And I don't know how to describe it except it's kind of a Ponzi scheme. Because they're going to have local governments, counties sell bonds, and the revenue is going to be future taxes are going to be levied against the buildings that might be built on the land that they cleaned up in the future. So leaving the taxpayer. And someone had, someone had carried the Department of Revenue. This is too much for the taxpayer. Cannot approve this for financing. And that was in the beginning and the end of the projects. And then the 2008, remember what happened in 2008? Mortgage scam, remember what they call securitized? So they have into a percentage basically. Jerrye finally sent a letter to Pennsauken saying, the current conditions, we don't proceed with the project. And I guess it was 6 or 8 months later, finally the United States for us to convene a meeting and accepted the gift that they had rejected 5 years. And that's the short version of the story. I'll tell the longer version, narrative book I'm writing.
Yeah. Petties from Petty Island. Yay!